The last race. The desert highway stretched endlessly under the pale blue sky, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren landscape where dreams came to die and legends were born. It was here, on this forgotten strip of road outside Bakersfield, that everything fell apart for Marcus Chen. Marcus lay sprawled on the scorching pavement, his body twisted in an awkward position that spoke of sudden violence. His leather jacket was torn at the shoulder, and his jeans were scuffed from the fall. At 23 years old, he had been full of fire and ambition, desperate to prove himself in the underground racing circuit that had consumed his life for the past 3 years. The blue BMW E30 idling behind him represented everything he had sacrificed. He'd bought it with money that should have gone to his mother's medical bills, spent countless nights in cramped garages rebuilding the engine, and neglected every relationship that mattered. The car was immaculate, a testament to his obsession, but it had cost him far more than the price tag suggested. Standing over Marcus were the faces of his former life. Jake, his childhood best friend, reached down with an outstretched hand, his face contorted with concern and something that looked like anger. They had grown up together in the same neighborhood, played baseball in the same dusty lots, and promised each other they'd make something of themselves. But that was before the racing, before Marcus had chosen the roar of engines over the voice of reason. Tyler, wearing an olive green shirt, stood nearby with his phone out, his thumb hovering over the screen. Should he call an ambulance? The police? Their crew had an unspoken rule about keeping things quiet, about handling their own problems without involving authorities who wouldn't understand their world. But this looked serious, and Tyler's conscience was screaming at him to break that code. Behind them, Marcus's older brother David watched with devastation etched across his weathered face. At 35, David had tried everything to pull Marcus away from this life. He'd offered him a job at his construction company, a chance to start fresh, to build something real instead of chasing the hollow glory of illegal street races. But Marcus had laughed it off, called him old and scared, said he didn't understand what it meant to truly live. The red Porsche Boxster gleamed in the afternoon sun like a pool of blood. It belonged to Vincent Russo, the man who had organized today's race. Vincent stood in the background, his face partially obscured by a pink circle, as if the universe itself was trying to censor his involvement in this tragedy. He was older, maybe 40, with money from sources nobody questioned and connections that made him untouchable. He'd promised Marcus that winning today's race would change everything, that the prize money would solve all his problems. What Vincent hadn't mentioned was that the race was rigged, that Marcus's opponent was driving a car with modifications that made competition impossible, and that the whole event was nothing more than entertainment for bored rich men who bet on these races like they were dog fights. Marcus had discovered the truth only minutes before. He'd confronted Vincent in front of everyone, his voice cracking with rage and betrayal. The argument had escalated quickly, with accusations and threats flying like sparks from a grinding wheel. Then Vincent's associate, a mountain of a man named Dmitri, had stepped forward and shoved Marcus hard. The push itself hadn't been that violent, but Marcus had stumbled backward, his heel catching on the uneven pavement, and he'd gone down hard. The sound of his head hitting the asphalt had been sickening, like a melon dropped from a height. For a moment, everything had frozen. The wind had stopped blowing, the distant traffic had seemed to fade, and all eyes had turned to the crumpled figure on the ground. Now, as Marcus lay there staring up at the sky, his vision swimming with spots and stars, his mind drifted back through the choices that had led him to this moment. He thought about his mother, Maria, sitting in her small apartment, probably watching her novellas and wondering why her son never called anymore. She had diabetes and high blood pressure, conditions that required expensive medication, but Marcus had stopped helping with those bills months ago. Every dollar had gone into the BMW instead. He thought about his ex-girlfriend, Sarah, who had begged him to quit racing after his first serious accident. She'd cried when she told him she couldn't watch him destroy himself, that loving him was like loving a ghost because he was already gone, already too far down a path she couldn't follow. He'd told her she didn't understand, that she was trying to cage him, to make him into something small and ordinary. She'd left 6 months ago, and he hadn't heard from her since. He thought about the scholarship he'd turned down, the full ride to UCLA that had represented everything his immigrant parents had worked for. His father, who had died when Marcus was 15, had always said education was the only real inheritance he could provide. But Marcus had rejected it, had chosen the immediate thrill of racing over the delayed gratification of building a real future. Jake knelt beside him now, his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Come on, man. Get up. This isn't worth it. None of this is worth it." His voice was thick with emotion, and Marcus could see tears forming in his friend's eyes. Jake had stayed loyal even when Marcus had pushed everyone else away, had shown up to races to make sure his friend was safe, had been there through arrests and accidents and all the chaos that came with this lifestyle. "I can't feel my legs," Marcus whispered, and the words seemed to suck all the air out of the moment. Jake's face went pale, and Tyler's phone slipped from his hand, clattering on the pavement. David let out a sound that was half sob, half roar, and lunged toward Vincent, but others in the crowd held him back. The desert wind picked up again, carrying with it the smell of motor oil and hot asphalt, the scent of broken dreams and wasted potential. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing closer. Someone had called for help after all, probably Tyler, who despite all his loyalty to the crew's code, had a daughter at home and couldn't stomach watching a man die over something as stupid as pride in racing. Marcus's thoughts grew hazier, his consciousness flickering like a dying light. He saw his father's face, remembered the old man's rough hands teaching him to change a tire when he was just 8 years old. His father had loved cars too, but he'd channeled that passion into honest work, into providing for his family. He'd been a mechanic at a dealership, nothing glamorous, but he'd been there every night for dinner, had helped Marcus with homework, had been present in all the ways that mattered. Where did I go wrong? Marcus wanted to ask his father's ghost. But he knew the answer. It wasn't one big decision that had brought him to this moment on the burning pavement. It was 1,000 small choices, each one taking him a little further from who he'd been raised to be, each one justified with the promise that the next race, the next win, the next rush of adrenaline would finally fill the empty space inside him. The thing about chasing speed, Marcus realized as his vision began to tunnel, was that you could never catch it. The faster you went, the faster you wanted to go. The higher the stakes, the higher you needed them to be to feel alive. It was an addiction as powerful as any drug, and just as destructive. The crowd around him had grown. More racers had arrived for the event, and now they stood in a loose circle, their faces reflecting shock and something else, recognition. Every one of them saw themselves in Marcus's broken body. Every one of them had taken similar risks, made similar choices, lived for the same fleeting moments of glory. Some would learn from this, would wake up and realize they were racing toward their own destruction. Others would file it away as an unfortunate accident, would tell themselves they were different, more careful, luckier. Vincent had disappeared, slipping away before the ambulance arrived, before there could be any official questions about what had happened. His Porsche was already gone, leaving nothing but tire marks and the faint smell of expensive cologne. He would host another race next week, find another desperate kid to exploit, and the cycle would continue. For men like Vincent, people like Marcus were disposable, temporary players in a game that would outlast them all. David finally broke free from the restraining hands and dropped to his knees beside his little brother. He cradled Marcus's head gently, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here, Marcus. I'm right here. You're going to be okay. You hear me? You're going to be fine." The words were as much prayer as promise, a desperate attempt to speak a different reality into existence. But Marcus could see the truth in his brother's eyes. He could feel it in the numbness spreading through his body, in the way sounds were growing distant and muffled. The ambulance was close now, maybe a minute away, but Marcus had the terrible suspicion that it was already too late, that he'd gambled one too many times and finally lost everything. He tried to speak, to tell David he was sorry, to ask him to take care of their mother, to admit that he'd been wrong about everything. But his mouth wouldn't cooperate, and all that came out was a wet, rattling sound that made David's face crumple. Jake was still holding his hand, and Marcus focused on that contact, that last tether to the world he was leaving. They'd been 7 years old when they met, two scrawny kids who'd bonded over a shared love of Hot Wheels and comic books. They'd promised to be friends forever, had carved their initials into a tree in Jake's backyard to seal the pact. Marcus wondered if that tree was still there, if their initials had grown and stretched with the bark, or if they'd been weathered away by time. The blue sky above him was absolutely clear, unmarred by a single cloud. It was the kind of perfect California day that appeared in tourist brochures and movie scenes, the kind of day that made you believe anything was possible. But for Marcus, it would be the last day he'd see. The last sky, the last breath of desert air, the last moment of consciousness before everything went dark. The ambulance screamed to a stop, and paramedics rushed forward with a stretcher and bags of equipment. They moved with practiced efficiency, barking questions that nobody could really answer. What happened? How long has he been down? Is he on any medications? The crowd stumbled over their responses, their voices overlapping in a confusion of partial truths and outright lies. As they loaded Marcus onto the stretcher, his hand slipped from Jake's grasp. His friend stood there, arms still outstretched, looking lost and small in a way that Marcus had never seen before. Tyler had recovered his phone and was recording everything now, documenting the aftermath of their lifestyle for reasons he probably didn't fully understand himself. The BMW E30 sat abandoned, its engine finally quiet. It looked somehow smaller now. Less impressive. Just a car like any other car, its significance shrinking in the face of real consequences. Someone would probably take it, strip it for parts or add it to their own collection. The car would outlive Marcus, would keep racing long after he was gone, an ironic monument to a life spent in pursuit of speed. David climbed into the ambulance with his brother, and the doors slammed shut, sealing them in a capsule of fluorescent light and medical equipment. Through the small window, the others watched as the vehicle pulled away, sirens wailing, lights flashing, racing toward a hospital that Marcus might not survive long enough to reach. The crowd dispersed slowly, people drifting back to their own cars, their own lives. The race that was supposed to happen today was canceled, though everyone knew there would be another one soon. There always was. The underground racing scene didn't stop for tragedy, it barely even slowed down. Tomorrow or next week, they'd be back on another stretch of empty highway, pushing their limits and testing fate, because that's what they did, because they couldn't imagine any other way to live. Jake and Tyler stayed behind, standing in the middle of the road where Marcus had fallen. The pavement was still warm from his body, and there was a small dark stain that might have been blood. They didn't speak, just stood there in the growing shadows of late afternoon, two friends trying to process how quickly everything had changed. 3 days later, Marcus Chen died in the ICU at Kern Medical Center. The fall had caused a traumatic brain injury and spinal damage that even the best surgeons couldn't repair. He never regained consciousness after arriving at the hospital, never got to say the apologies that had been building up in his throat, never got to make any of it right. His mother, Maria, sat by his bedside until the end, holding his hand and whispering prayers in Spanish. David made arrangements for the funeral, choosing a modest casket because their family couldn't afford anything elaborate, not after Marcus had drained their resources for his racing obsession. Sarah came to the service, standing in the back, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses, crying for the boy she'd loved and the man he'd failed to become. Jake gave a eulogy that broke everyone's hearts. He talked about the Marcus he'd known as a child, the one who'd been kind and funny and full of dreams that didn't involve risking his life for the approval of strangers. He mentioned the tree with their carved initials, and how he'd gone to check on it the night Marcus died. The tree was still there, their names still visible, a reminder of innocence and promises and everything they'd lost along the way. The racing scene barely acknowledged his passing. Vincent Russo was already organizing his next event. The spots in the races were filled by new faces, young and hungry and convinced they were invincible. The blue BMW E30 was purchased by a collector who'd heard about its previous owner's death and thought it gave the car character, made it more valuable. On the anniversary of Marcus's death, his brother David returned to that stretch of highway outside Bakersfield. He brought flowers and a framed photo of Marcus from before the racing, back when his smile still reached his eyes. He placed them on the roadside and stood there for a long time, watching the cars speed past, listening to the wind howl across the empty desert. The pavement had long since been scrubbed clean, and there was no physical evidence that anything tragic had ever happened there. But David remembered. Jake remembered. Everyone who'd been there that day remembered the sound of Marcus hitting the ground, the terrible silence that followed, and the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, everything would turn out okay. It didn't, of course. It never does when you live your life like a race with no finish line, when you convince yourself that speed and danger and adrenaline are substitutes for purpose and connection and love. Marcus had learned that lesson too late, had paid for his education with his life. The desert highway stretched endlessly under the sky, indifferent to human tragedy, waiting for the next lost soul who would mistake velocity for direction, who would confuse the rush of speed with the satisfaction of arriving somewhere that mattered. The road didn't judge, didn't warn, didn't care. It simply existed, patient and eternal, ready to claim its next victim in the endless cycle of risk and consequence. And somewhere, in a small apartment in the city, Marcus's mother kept his childhood bedroom exactly as he'd left it, unable to accept that her baby boy was never coming home, that all her sacrifices and hopes and dreams had ended on a hot stretch of pavement where nobody even knew his name, where he was just another casualty in a war that nobody wins. The end.